Have you ever found yourself in a moment so bizarre that you couldn't decide whether to laugh, cry, or just quietly question the universe's sense of humor? Like that time you mistook someone waving at the person behind you for waving at you, and you enthusiastically waved back, only to realize mid-wave that the interaction was never meant for you. Yeah, we've all been there, haven't we? But let me take you back to one particular moment in my life, a moment so ridiculous, so oddly timed, that I couldn't have scripted it better if I tried. Picture this, a small, crowded bakery on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The kind of place where the smell of freshly baked bread wraps around you like a warm hug, and the soft hum of conversations makes the world outside feel a little less cold. I was there to buy a simple loaf of bread, but life had other plans. It started innocently enough. I walked in, umbrella dripping water onto the welcome mat, my shoes making that awful squeaky sound with every step. The bakery was packed. Clearly, I wasn't the only one seeking comfort carbs that day. I squeezed into the line, my stomach growling louder than I'd like to admit. Everything seemed normal until I noticed him. You know how every chaotic situation seems to have one calm, unbothered soul who looks like they've mastered the art of Zen? That was him. Tall, casually dressed, leaning against the counter with a half smile, as if the world's chaos didn't apply to him. And then it happened. Our eyes met for a split second, a brief moment of shared acknowledgement. Or so I thought. He started walking toward me, his smile growing wider. My heart did that little fluttery thing it does when you're sure a handsome stranger is about to strike up a conversation. Wow, I thought. Maybe this rainy Tuesday isn't so bad after all. But instead of stopping in front of me, he walked right past. Past me, past the line, and straight to the counter where he handed the cashier a wad of cash. That's when I saw it. The tray of cinnamon rolls. The last tray of cinnamon rolls, to be exact. Suddenly, it wasn't just about bread anymore. It was about justice, about fairness, about the universal rule of waiting your turn. I mean, who does that? Just cuts the line like they own the bakery. My mood flipped faster than a pancake, and before I knew it, I was doing something I'd never imagined myself doing, standing up to a stranger in public. What came next? Well, let's just say it was a turning point, not just for the day, but for everything that came after. Little did I know that one random act of boldness in a bakery would set off a chain of events that would change my life in ways I couldn't have dreamed. Curious. Hold on to that thought, because this story is just getting started. The rain had been falling all morning, the kind that's not quite heavy enough for a downpour, but persistent enough to make the air feel damp and clingy. Outside, the streets of our little neighborhood bustled with a quiet kind of energy. You know the vibe, a sleepy suburb waking up just enough to get through the day. Kids splashed in puddles with their neon rain boots, dogs in colorful raincoats tugged at their leashes, and umbrellas bobbed along like jellyfish in a sea of grey. Nestled between a mom-and-pop bookstore and a flower shop that always smelled of lavender and eucalyptus was the bakery. The bakery. It wasn't just any bakery. It was the place everyone went when they needed a pick-me-up. The faded wooden sign above the door read, Maggie's Bake Shop, painted in a cheerful script that somehow hadn't faded despite years of wear. The windows were always fogged up, and through the glass, you could see rows of pastries displayed like treasures in a museum. Inside, the warmth hit you immediately, a comforting mix of freshly baked bread, cinnamon, and vanilla. Maggie herself was behind the counter, as she always was, her round glasses slipping down her nose as she juggled taking orders and giving instructions to her staff. She was in her late 60s, with a knack for remembering not just your name, but your usual and the last time you come in. Then there was her assistant, Jessie, a lanky teenager with a mop of curly hair that seemed to have a mind of its own. Jessie was quick with a joke and quicker with a smile, but he had a habit of forgetting orders mid-conversation. On busy days, Maggie would holler his name like a coach on the sidelines, Jesse, focus. And everyone would chuckle, knowing it was all in good fun. The bakery had its regulars too. Old Mr. Watkins sat in his usual spot by the window, nursing a cup of coffee that was mostly cream and sugar. He always had a crossword puzzle spread out in front of him, and if you lingered long enough, he'd rope you into helping him solve it. The Johnson twins, Sarah and Sophie, were at their usual table in the corner, whispering over a shared plate of chocolate chip cookies. And then there was Mrs. Pattle, who came every Tuesday for a loaf of sourdough and a chat with Maggie about her grandchildren. The place was alive with chatter, the kind of noise that doesn't overwhelm, but makes you feel part of something. The bell above the door jingled every few minutes as more people came in, shaking off rain and stomping their feet to warm up. Coats hung over the backs of chairs, and scarves were draped over the table edges, forgotten in the excitement of pastries and warm drinks. And there I was, squeezed into the line, taking it all in. The rain had soaked through my shoes, and my umbrella was dripping onto the floor, but none of that seemed to matter. There was something about being in Maggie's that made you forget the little annoyances of the day. I couldn't help but glance around, studying the faces around me. That's when I noticed him. Tall, effortlessly cool, and completely at ease. He leaned against the counter as if he belonged there, like Maggie's bakery was his personal living room. He had this kind of relaxed energy that made you curious. Was he an artist? A writer? Maybe a musician? He wasn't the only one catching my attention, though. There was a little boy tugging at his mom's coat, pointing excitedly at the display case. "The chocolate one, Mom." "Please," he begged, his big brown eyes impossible to resist. His mom laughed, surrendering to his enthusiasm, and Jesse, bless him, was juggling 2 plates of croissants and nearly collided with a woman balancing a tray of coffee cups. Sorry, he exclaimed, his face turning red as everyone laughed good-naturedly. It was a scene of organized chaos, the kind that feels alive and welcoming. This was the heart of the neighborhood, a place where everyone had a story, and somehow they all overlapped here. Little did I know, my own story was about to take a wild turn in this very spot, surrounded by the comforting hum of Maggie's bake shop. As I shuffled forward in the line, my mind wandered. What would Maggie recommend today? Should I try the almond croissant or stick with my usual sourdough? But before I could decide, fate, or perhaps a very specific tray of cinnamon rolls, had other plans for me. It all started with a cinnamon roll. Not just any cinnamon roll, mind you. This was Maggie's signature giant cinnamon roll, the one people swore could cure a bad day and mend broken hearts. It was the size of a dinner plate, dripping with gooey icing, and always served warm. I'd been eyeing it from the back of the line, my stomach growling at the thought of it. By the time I reached the counter, I had my mind made up. "1 cinnamon roll, please," I said with a grin, already tasting the sugary goodness in my imagination. Jesse, still flustered from his near-coffee spill, blinked at me. "Oh, I think we're out," he stammered, glancing nervously over his shoulder at the display case. Out? Impossible. There had been at least 3 left when I walked in. Maggie overheard from her station at the espresso machine and chimed in. No, Jesse, there's 1 left in the kitchen." I set it aside for. She paused, her eyes darting to the man leaning against the counter. "Oh no." "Set it aside for who, Maggie?" he asked, a playful smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Maggie hesitated, clearly caught in some kind of cinnamon roll diplomacy. "Well, you see," she trailed off, looking between us. It was obvious. Maggie had promised the last cinnamon roll to him. "You're not serious," I said, trying to keep my tone light, but unable to hide the disappointment creeping into my voice. I'd been dreaming about that cinnamon roll since the rain started, and now it was slipping through my fingers. The man turned to me, his smirk widening. "Looks like we have a bit of a situation here," he said, crossing his arms. He wasn't being rude. If anything, He seemed amused by the whole thing. Maybe we could split it, I offered, half joking but also completely serious. He raised an eyebrow. Split the greatest cinnamon roll in the city. That feels wrong. Wrong is you taking the last one, I shot back, unable to help myself. Jesse, sensing the growing tension, or perhaps just desperate to avoid Maggie's wrath, quickly stepped in. Hey, maybe we can figure something out. Maggie, you've got more dough, right? We can make another batch. It takes hours, Jesse, Maggie said, sighing. That cinnamon roll is the last one until tomorrow. The man and I exchanged glances. For a moment, it felt like we were characters in a sitcom, locked in a standoff over a pastry. The other customers, sensing the drama, started to watch with poorly concealed interest. Well, the man said finally, looks like we've got ourselves a cinnamon roll dilemma. What's it gonna be? I wasn't sure whether to laugh or glare at him. All I knew was that the battle for the last cinnamon roll had officially begun, and somehow it was shaping up to be the most absurdly entertaining part of my day. The beloved owner of the cafe, Maggie, is the kind of person who always seems to know what everyone needs before they do. With her wild curls barely tamed by a colourful scarf and an apron perpetually dusted with flour, she's equal parts nurturing and chaotic. Maggie's cafe isn't just a business, it's a sanctuary for the town. People come in for her baked goods, sure, but they stay because Maggie has an uncanny ability to make them feel like family. Her cinnamon rolls are famous for a reason, and she takes immense pride in that fact. Then there's Jesse, her 20-something nephew, who's working at the cafe while figuring out his next steps. Jesse is tall, lanky, and perpetually flustered. He has a good heart, but a knack for creating minor disasters, like accidentally giving someone decaf instead of their much-needed triple-shot espresso. Despite his occasional slip-ups, customers adore him for his goofy charm. He's also fiercely loyal to Maggie and the cafe, often staying late to help clean up or coming in early to try, and fail, to learn her baking techniques. Enter me, a regular at the cafe, who considers Maggie's cinnamon rolls a necessary indulgence. I'm something of a cinnamon roll connoisseur, and Maggie's creations have set the bar impossibly high. My visits to the cafe are less about caffeine and more about the comfort it brings, a cozy nook where I can unwind, people watch, and escape the humdrum of daily life. And then there's him. I didn't catch his name during our cinnamon roll standoff, but he has the kind of easy confidence that makes you want to roll your eyes and laugh at the same time. He's tall, with sharp blue eyes that sparkle with mischief, and an air of someone who's never lost a cinnamon roll battle in his life. Based on his banter with Maggie, he's clearly not a stranger here, though I can't recall seeing him before. Our first real interaction, if you can call it that, happened during that fateful moment when the last cinnamon roll came into play. But as the day unfolded, I began to notice little quirks about him. He had a habit of drumming his fingers on the counter while waiting, as if he couldn't sit still for too long. He smiled easily, but there was a hint of determination in his expression, especially when food was involved. What stood out most, though, was his dynamic with Maggie and Jesse. Where Maggie doted on him like a favorite nephew, Jesse seemed slightly exasperated by his presence. "You're not seriously going to let him take the last cinnamon roll?" Jesse muttered at one point, just loud enough for me to hear. "He has a tab the size of the Grand Canyon," Maggie replied, rolling her eyes but smiling nonetheless. Over the next half hour, our interactions grew more playful. "Do you always fight strangers over pastries?" he asked with mock seriousness as I tried to convince Maggie to let me have the roll. "Only when it's worth it," I shot back, feigning a grin that was equal parts charming and infuriating. Meanwhile, Jesse tried to mediate, though his efforts only added to the chaos. At one point, he accidentally spilled coffee on himself while attempting to refill someone's cup, prompting Maggie to shoo him to the back. By the time the cinnamon roll debacle reached its peak, it became clear that this wasn't just about a pastry. It was about pride, humor, and the kind of banter that makes an otherwise ordinary day unforgettable. Each character brought something unique to the scene. Maggie's warmth and unflappable nature, Jesse's endearing clumsiness, my quiet determination, and the man's quick wit and mischievous grin. Together, we created a moment that felt less like a conflict and more like the start of something unexpectedly delightful. Though none of us could have guessed it at the time, the cinnamon roll showdown was just the beginning. It all started with an innocent misunderstanding, the kind that spirals into chaos before anyone realizes what's happening. The cafe was buzzing with its usual morning rush. Maggie was orchestrating orders like a symphony conductor. Jesse was manning the espresso machine, or trying to, and I had just settled into my favorite corner seat with a fresh cup of coffee. Across the room, Mr. Cinnamon Roll Rival was doing the same, shooting me a cheeky grin as if to remind me that he'd won our pastry standoff. Everything was running smoothly, or as smoothly as it ever does, when Maggie stepped out briefly to take a delivery. "Jesse, you're in charge," she called over her shoulder. It was an announcement that sent a ripple of mild concern through the room. Jesse looked as confident as a baby bird attempting its first flight. "Don't worry, Aunt Maggie, I've got this," Jesse said, puffing out his chest. But as soon as the door swung shut, the chaos began. It all hinged on a mix-up with a to-go order. The cafe had recently started a pre-order system to keep up with demand, and Maggie had lovingly packaged the last cinnamon roll, a replacement from the morning's earlier batch, for a customer who was supposed to pick it up at 10:00 a.m. But Jesse, ever the eager beaver, saw the roll sitting on the counter, assumed it was up for grabs, and decided to surprise me with it. "Here," Jesse said with a grin, dropping the pastry onto my table like it was a peace offering. "On the house. Consider it an apology for the earlier dispute." I blinked. Was this a trap? Was Maggie secretly watching from the kitchen to see if I'd take the bait? "Oh, thanks," I replied cautiously, glancing across the room at Mr. Rival. He caught sight of the cinnamon roll and immediately raised an eyebrow, his expression a mix of amusement and indignation. "Wait a second," he called out, striding over. "How come she gets the roll after all that?" Jesse scratched the back of his neck, suddenly looking less confident. "It was just sitting there." "No, it wasn't," Mr. Rival said, his tone half joking, half serious. "That's the one Maggie saved for the pre-order." Cue collective gasps from the cafe's other patrons, who were now fully invested in the unfolding drama. Jesse's face turned a shade of red that matched the cafe's gingham tablecloths. "I thought it was an extra," Jesse stammered. "I didn't know it was for someone specific." "Well, now what?" I asked, staring down at the cinnamon roll as if it were a ticking time bomb. "Do I eat it? Put it back." Mr. Rival leaned against my table, grinning like the cat who caught the canary. "I think the only fair solution is a duel." "A duel?" I repeated, incredulous. He nodded solemnly. "Winner takes the roll. Jesse can referee." "Absolutely not," I said, though I couldn't suppress a laugh. By this point, the cafe's atmosphere had shifted into full-blown sitcom territory. Other customers were chiming in with suggestions. Everything from rock, paper, scissors to a cinnamon roll trivia quiz. Jesse, eager to redeem himself, suggested a roll-off where we'd each attempt to recreate Maggie's recipe and let the customers decide whose was better. "Do you even know how to bake?" I asked my rival, crossing my arms. "Does it matter?" He replied with a shrug. "I've got enthusiasm and a competitive spirit. That counts for something." Before I could respond, the cafe door jingled, and a woman in a smart blazer walked in, looking confused. "Hi, I'm here to pick up my cinnamon roll order." The room froze. "Oh no," Jesse whispered, his eyes darting to the roll on my table. "That's her cinnamon roll." The woman's gaze followed Jessie's, landing squarely on me and the pastry in question. Her polite smile faltered. Is that mine? Not exactly, Mr. Rival interjected, stepping in like he was about to give a press conference. There's been a slight misunderstanding. A slight misunderstanding, she repeated, her tone sharp. You see, he continued, undeterred. Jessie here accidentally gave your roll to her, he pointed at me. But we were just about to resolve the situation with a friendly baking competition. The woman blinked, clearly wondering if she'd walked into the wrong cafe. Jessie tried to smooth things over by offering her a free coffee and a voucher for her next visit, but she wasn't having it. I don't want coffee, she said firmly. I want my cinnamon roll. At this point, Maggie returned, looking bewildered by the scene before her. What on earth is going on? Jessie gave away the pre-order roll, someone piped up helpfully. And now they're planning a bake-off, another added. Maggie closed her eyes and took a deep breath, the kind that mothers everywhere take when their children have done something ridiculous. Okay, she said finally. First of all, nobody touches the cinnamon roll. It's going back to its rightful owner. She shot Jessie a look that made him wilt like a flower in the desert. And second, she added, turning to Mr. Rival and me, if you two want to settle this with a bake-off, you're welcome to use my kitchen after hours. But for now, everyone's going to sit down, enjoy their coffee, and stop acting like this is the Great British Bake-Off. There was a murmur of agreement as the crowd dispersed, though the air still buzzed with anticipation. Mr. Rival gave me a mock bow. Guess we'll have to save our jewel for later. Don't get too cocky, I replied, unable to resist a grin. You haven't seen my baking skills yet. The woman finally got her cinnamon roll. Jessie avoided further catastrophe, for the moment, and Maggie resumed her rightful place as queen of the cafe. But as I sat back down with my coffee, I couldn't help but feel like the cinnamon roll saga was far from over. The bake-off preparation was in full swing, and let me tell you, it was turning out to be far more complicated than I anticipated. Mr. Rival, whose real name I now learned was Alex, had somehow managed to borrow a professional chef's hat and an apron that read "Bake it till you make it." Classic. We'd agreed to meet at Maggie's cafe after closing hours to settle the cinnamon roll duel once and for all. Maggie had reluctantly agreed to be the judge, though she spent most of the day rolling her eyes at the absurdity of it all. Jessie, ever the eager organizer, had set up 2 baking stations with all the necessary ingredients. He was taking his role as referee a little too seriously, even drawing up a scorecard. Things started smoothly enough, but chaos wasn't far behind. How many teaspoons are in a tablespoon? Alex called out, squinting at his recipe. 3, I replied automatically, then paused. Wait, why am I helping you? Because you're kind-hearted and secretly rooting for me, he shot back with a grin, dumping a suspiciously large heap of cinnamon into his bowl. Meanwhile, my dough was refusing to cooperate. Despite my best efforts, it clung stubbornly to the rolling pin like a toddler who didn't want to leave the playground. Jessie wandered over to inspect my progress, frowning. Is it supposed to look like that? He asked, poking at the dough. Yes, I said defensively, though I wasn't entirely sure. Across the room, Alex was dealing with his own disaster. He'd somehow managed to get flour everywhere, on his face, in his hair, even on Maggie's pristine countertop. I think my dough is alive, he announced, holding up a blob that wobbled ominously. It's called yeast, Maggie said dryly from the corner. As the bake-off continued, unexpected obstacles kept popping up. Jessie accidentally turned the oven to the wrong temperature, leading to a moment of frantic adjustment. Alex mistook salt for sugar at one point, only realizing his mistake when Maggie intervened with a raised eyebrow. Oh, come on, he groaned, dumping his ruined mixture into the trash. This isn't sabotage, is it? Only if you sabotage yourself, Maggie replied with a smirk. Despite the setbacks, we both managed to get our rolls into the oven. The air filled with the warm, comforting scent of cinnamon and butter, and for a moment, it seemed like everything might actually work out. Just as we were about to declare victory, the power flickered ominously, and the oven lights dimmed. Did we just blow a fuse? Alex asked, peering at the now dark appliance. Maggie sighed. I told Jessie not to plug in 3 mixers at once. Wait, so what happens to the cinnamon rolls? I asked, my voice tinged with panic. Good question, Maggie said, crossing her arms. Guess we'll find out when the power comes back. Cue the suspenseful pause as everyone turned to stare at the oven. Would the rolls survive the blackout? Would we have to start all over again? And most importantly, who would claim cinnamon roll glory? Somewhere in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but laugh. This bake-off was becoming less about cinnamon rolls and more about the adventure along the way. As the room filled with the warm, buttery aroma of cinnamon rolls, despite the earlier chaos, it was clear that something magical was happening. The power had returned, just in time to salvage our bakes. Maggie slid the trays out of the oven with practiced ease, and we all leaned in to inspect the results. Well there, definitely cinnamon rolls, Jessie said diplomatically, though his raised eyebrows suggested he wasn't ready to commit to more than that. Alex and I exchanged worried glances. Guess it's time for the taste test, I said, attempting to muster some confidence. Maggie sliced into each batch with the precision of a surgeon, placing equal portions onto plates. Jessie, acting as both referee and comic relief, dramatically sniffed the rolls before taking a bite. His expression remained inscrutable. Well? Alex asked, leaning forward. Jessie paused for effect, then broke into a grin. Not bad. A little heavy on the cinnamon, but not bad. Alex let out a relieved laugh, but my curiosity got the better of me. I reached for a piece of my own roll, biting into it tentatively. It wasn't perfect, but it tasted like home, sweet, comforting, and full of effort. Then came Maggie's verdict. Both of you managed to bake cinnamon rolls. That's the good news, she began. And the bad news? Alex prompted. Neither of you followed the recipe properly. She held up my bowl, which still contained a glob of sticky dough. For starters, you didn't knead yours enough. And Alex? That's way too much cinnamon. Are you trying to turn this into a health hazard? We both burst out laughing, the tension melting away like butter on a hot roll. It was ridiculous, really. All this drama over cinnamon rolls that were, at best, amateur efforts. But that's when it hit me. This whole competition wasn't really about proving who was the better baker. It was about the shared experience, the laughter, the mistakes, the camaraderie. Somewhere between the flying flour and the oven mishaps, Alex and I had stopped being rivals and started being friends, or something close to it. What I didn't know at the time was just how important Alex would become in my life. The revelation came when Maggie handed Alex an envelope. This was in the mail for you, she said casually, as if it were the strangest timing in the world. Alex's expression shifted from confusion to delight as he opened it. It's from the city council, he exclaimed. City council? I asked, intrigued. He nodded, holding up a formal-looking document. They're approving funding for the community garden project I proposed months ago. My jaw dropped. You're the one behind that? Guilty as charged, he said, grinning. I've been trying to get it off the ground forever, but it's been an uphill battle. Turns out cinnamon rolls were good luck after all. That's when everything clicked. The guy I'd been squabbling with over a seat in a cafe was the same person quietly working to make our town a better place. Well, I guess that makes you a local hero, I said, feeling a pang of guilt for ever doubting him. Hardly, Alex replied, though his grin didn't fade. But I could use some help planting those roses you're so fond of. The tension between us dissolved in that moment, replaced by something lighter, warmer. It was the kind of discovery that didn't just resolve the immediate conflict, it made everything that came before it worthwhile. Who knew that a battle over cinnamon rolls would lead to an unexpected friendship and a chance to contribute to something meaningful? It was the sweetest twist of all, and not just because of the sugar and spice. As the excitement of Alex's community garden project took over, there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. What had begun as a rather comical and competitive mess of flour, sugar, and mishaps had turned into something far more meaningful. As we stood in the kitchen, surrounded by slightly burnt cinnamon rolls and empty bowls, a sense of accomplishment hung in the air. I caught Maggie looking at Alex with an expression that mirrored my own, pride and admiration. This wasn't just about baking anymore. It was about growth, both personal and communal. "You really did it," I said, my voice a little more sincere than I had intended. "You're making a real difference around here." Alex, who had been the quiet and often sarcastic one throughout the whole baking competition, had a rare moment of vulnerability. He ran a hand through his hair, as if suddenly unsure of how to handle the spotlight. "Well, I'm just trying to do my part. It's small, but it's something." Maggie gave a small laugh. "Small? You're going to have an entire garden in the middle of downtown. That's not small, that's huge." She was right. I couldn't help but think back to when I first met Alex. Back then, I had pegged him as just another person who liked to stir the pot for the fun of it. Someone who didn't care about anything beyond his own personal satisfaction. But here he was, a quiet force of positivity, working hard to build something for the community, not himself. And it hit me then. Maybe I had underestimated not just Alex, but myself too. The competitive spirit that had driven me to win the baking contest now seemed irrelevant. The goal had never been to outdo Alex in the kitchen. It had been about finding a connection, a way to grow beyond the surface-level interactions we'd had before. In that moment, I felt something shift within me too. The snark and the jokes I had used to keep people at arm's length started to feel a little empty. Maybe it was time to move beyond that, to be a part of something bigger, something that wasn't defined by personal gain or pride. I could see it in Alex's eyes too, a quiet recognition that this, whatever this was more than a competition. It was the beginning of something new. Maggie's voice broke through my thoughts. "So, what do you say? You both in for helping me with this garden?" I looked at Alex, whose smile had transformed from the typical smirk into a full-fledged grin. It wasn't a grin born from victory or one-upping anyone. It was the kind of smile that came with the realization that, yes, this was what mattered. This was something real. "I'm in," I said without hesitation, feeling lighter than I had in a long time. It wasn't just about the garden or even the cinnamon rolls. It was about growing together in a way that was more than just a challenge or a contest. It was about friendship, community, and finding joy in something bigger than yourself. Alex nodded, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Looks like we've got a garden to build." And just like that, the emotional shift was complete. From a quirky baking challenge to a moment of personal growth and connection, it felt like a new chapter was opening for all of us. It wasn't the kind of high that came from winning or competing. It was the kind of high that came from realizing, together, that we were capable of more than we had ever imagined. The moment of truth arrived during the final meeting of the Community Garden Committee. What had begun as a light-hearted kitchen competition now carried the weight of a real decision. How would we divvy up the garden space? We had all put in hours of planning, digging, and occasionally laughing ourselves to tears over our less-than-perfect attempts at landscaping. But now we had to decide who would take on which section of the garden. The air was filled with an odd mix of excitement and nervousness as we sat around the small wooden table in the community center. Maggie, ever the optimist, was already grinning ear to ear, certain that everyone would get along and work seamlessly. Alex, on the other hand, had a more laid-back attitude, already imagining a few quirky garden gnomes to keep watch over his patch. I Well, I was somewhere in between, still adjusting to the idea of taking part in something like this, but not quite sure how to navigate the new dynamics. Maggie, of course, took charge. Okay, so we'll each get a designated area, she said, her voice bubbling with enthusiasm. It's only fair, right? I glanced over at Alex, who was tapping his pen on the table. His face had that mischievous look, the one that suggested he was about to make a joke at someone else's expense. Well, what if I want the biggest patch? He said casually, leaning back in his chair. I mean, I've been known to grow a pretty impressive pumpkin or two. The table fell silent for a moment as everyone stared at him. Maggie raised an eyebrow. Oh, really? Because I've heard your pumpkins are more like squashes. She giggled, clearly not buying into Alex's bravado. Alex chuckled. Fair enough, but maybe I'll take the least convenient spot, just to see who can handle it. That was when I felt it, the small tug in my gut. A challenge had been laid down, but this time it wasn't one to win. It was a decision about how we would move forward together. We had all been playing around with small, funny games and jabs, but the moment was real now. We had to decide where we each fit in the grand scheme of this garden. Without thinking, I stood up, pushing my chair back with a slight scrape. You know what? I'll take the spot by the fence, I said, pointing to the area that everyone else had been avoiding. I'll prove that the least convenient spot can still be the best one. Everyone's eyes turned toward me, and for a moment, I wondered if I had made a mistake. Was it too bold? Was I trying too hard to show that I could handle it? But then Maggie's face lit up with a huge grin. I love it. That's the spirit. She stood up and clapped her hands. Let's get going, team. We've got a garden to plant. Alex shrugged, a playful grin on his face. Well, you're taking the fence. I guess I'll claim the spot by the gazebo. Someone has to make sure the gnomes have proper supervision. The group burst into laughter, and just like that, any lingering tension or doubt melted away. There were no heavy consequences to our decisions, no right or wrong answers. We were making choices not based on competition or outcome, but on how we could all contribute to something that was bigger than ourselves. A small garden, perhaps, but it had the potential to grow into something much more meaningful. In the end, our decisions didn't just divide the garden, it united us. There was no need for dramatic confrontations or hard choices. In this quirky little community, even the silliest decisions carried a sense of light-hearted resolution. And as we all stood up to grab our gardening gloves and head outside, I realized that this was the kind of community I'd always been looking for, where decisions didn't carry weight, but rather they added to the joy of the journey. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden light over the community garden. It had been a long day, full of digging, planting, and, of course, the occasional mess-up. But by now, everything had settled into place. The garden was starting to look like a real masterpiece, and the committee members were feeling proud of what they'd accomplished. The initial conflict, the miscommunication about who should take which plot, the joking around, the little snags that had caused tension, seemed a distant memory. Everyone had found their rhythm, their spaces in the garden, and we were all on the same page. The lightheartedness that had once filled the air with playful jabs had transformed into genuine camaraderie. I leaned on my shovel, surveying the rows of plants. There was something incredibly satisfying about the neat rows of vegetables, flowers, and herbs that were now taking root in the soil. Despite the initial chaos, we had come together and worked as a team. It wasn't just about the garden anymore. It was about the relationships that had formed in the process. Hey, I think we've really done it, Alex said, stepping over to me with a grin on his face. His shirt was covered in dirt, and his hands were as messy as mine, but he wore his labor with pride. I never thought I'd actually enjoy gardening, but this is kinda fun. Yeah, I agreed, wiping my forehead with the back of my hand. And I think we've all learned a little something about patience. I was worried at first that we'd end up fighting over who got what spot. But now, look at this. It's like we're one big gardening family. Maggie, who had been busy tidying up her area, joined us with a laugh. When we first started, I was worried about how things would go. But seeing you two work together, it's been amazing. I think this community is stronger than we realize. There was a brief pause as we all took in what she had said. It wasn't just about the plants growing. It was about how we had all grown as a group. The humor that had fueled the early days of our project had given way to something deeper. We had gone from playful competitors to actual collaborators, each of us bringing our quirks, strengths, and personalities to the table. "What about that fence plot?" Alex asked, still with that light teasing tone. "Think you're going to win the gardening crown for the best pumpkins?" I chuckled, glancing over at the small patch I'd claimed by the fence. The pumpkins weren't the most spectacular, but they were growing. And somehow, that felt like a win in itself. "I'm not in it for the crown," I said with a wink. "I'm just here to prove that the less convenient spot can be just as good as any other." Maggie nodded. "You've definitely proven that." She glanced around the garden, taking in the results of our efforts. "I think we've all made something great here, and maybe, just maybe, we've learned something about working together too." At that moment, there was a sound in the distance, a sound that had become familiar over the past few weeks. It was the laughter and chatter of the neighbors, coming to check on our progress. One by one, they wandered into the garden, their faces lighting up as they saw the transformation. "What is this?" one of the neighbors asked, her eyes widening in surprise. "This garden looks amazing." "Well, it's a team effort," I replied, waving my hand around the garden. "We've all pitched in to make this happen." Maggie added, "And it's not just about the plants. It's about how we came together as a community." Alex nodded. "Yeah, and it didn't hurt that we all had a little fun along the way." The neighbors wandered through, admiring the work we'd done, and everyone was in high spirits. The project that had once felt like a source of tension and uncertainty had turned into something we were all proud of. The initial confusion, the small misunderstandings, the fear of not knowing where each of us fit, all of that had been swept away in the flow of the work. And in the end, what was left was a sense of accomplishment and unity. As the last rays of sunlight bathed the garden in a warm glow, we gathered together, standing side by side. The garden was more than just a patch of land now. It was a symbol of how far we'd come as a group. A little bit of humor, a few mix-ups, and some hard work had transformed our differences into something truly special. There was a sense of satisfaction in the air, as if all the loose threads had been tied together into a neat, happy bow. And so, the conflict that had initially felt overwhelming, a misunderstanding about the plots, a touch of rivalry, and a few awkward moments, had resolved itself in the best way possible, not through confrontation, but through understanding, laughter, and teamwork. Everyone had played their part, and no one had been left behind. There was no lingering tension, no unresolved issues, just a collective sense of relief and joy. In that moment, I realized that sometimes the best way to resolve a conflict isn't through confrontation or serious decisions. Sometimes, it's just about finding the right balance, the right people, and the right sense of humor to turn a small misunderstanding into something bigger and better. As the sun set on our newly transformed garden, a sense of fulfillment settled over us all. It wasn't just the sight of flourishing plants or the satisfaction of a job well done. It was the knowledge that we had all grown, both as individuals and as a group. Each of us had come to this project with our own quirks, but we were walking away from it changed for the better. Alex, for one, had learned a valuable lesson about patience. The guy who had once approached the garden like a race, always trying to be first to plant or finish a task, had slowed down. Watching him sit cross-legged beside his garden plot, carefully arranging his rows of vegetables, there was no doubt that he had found a new sense of peace in the process. Gardening, he'd admitted in the quiet moments, had taught him the value of taking things slow and letting nature run its course. But more importantly, it had given him the space to connect with others in a way he hadn't before. "I've been so caught up in competition," Alex had said earlier in the day, his eyes scanning the rows of plants we'd all worked on together. "I didn't realize how good it could feel to just collaborate. I think I'll keep coming to the garden, not because of the plants, but because of the people." Maggie, too, had grown in her own unique way. The woman who'd once been apprehensive about stepping into leadership roles had found herself at the heart of the group's success. She had been the one to bring us all together when it seemed like we were losing momentum. Maggie's gentle yet firm way of handling the occasional disagreement or slight confusion had proven to be the glue that kept us all grounded. Her quiet strength had earned her the respect of the group, and even more so, it had given her a sense of confidence she hadn't had before. "I never thought I'd be the one to rally everyone," Maggie admitted as we tidied up the last of the tools. "But somehow, I ended up being the one who kept us all going. And I kind of liked it. Maybe it's time I start taking more chances in life too." I couldn't help but smile, proud of the growth we'd all experienced. But as for me, I had learned that it wasn't always about getting everything perfect. When the garden first started, I had obsessed over details, making sure each plant was spaced precisely, ensuring every row was symmetrical. But as I spent more time in the soil, I realized that there was a certain beauty in imperfection. The garden was never going to be flawless, and that was okay. What mattered was the process, the connection to the earth, and the people who shared the journey with me. By the time we wrapped up, everyone was in good spirits, chatting freely, laughing about little slip-ups and celebrating our shared success. As we stood together one last time, our hands still dirt-streaked but our hearts full, it was clear that we had created something far more meaningful than a garden. We had built relationships. We had turned an initially chaotic, disjointed effort into a harmonious, united creation. And perhaps, more than anything, we had learned that life wasn't about avoiding misunderstandings or running from challenges. It was about embracing the moments of confusion, finding the humor in them, and working together to bring about something beautiful in the end. As each of us left the garden that day, there was a sense of peace, a feeling that we had not only completed a task, but had done so with a newfound respect for each other and ourselves. We had all come out of the experience in a better place, more connected, more patient, and more willing to embrace the messy, wonderful journey that life had to offer. As we stood there, admiring the garden we had so carefully cultivated, every plant now in bloom, every corner filled with vibrant color, there was an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. The journey, though unexpected at times, had taught us all something that, in the beginning, we hadn't even anticipated. That life, much like gardening, doesn't have to be perfect to be beautiful. We had all come to the garden with a mission in mind, driven by a variety of different motivations. Some of us were trying to prove something to ourselves, others were just looking for a way to unwind, and a few, like Alex, were in it for the potential of bragging rights. But by the end, it wasn't about the perfect row of carrots or the tallest sunflower. No, it was about what we had discovered along the way, that the process of growing, whether it's plants or relationships, was more valuable than the final result. It was Maggie who summed it up best as we stood back and admired our work. She smiled and said, "You know, it's funny. We started this thinking we were just creating a garden, but what we really created was a little bit of peace for ourselves, and a lot of laughs along the way." And she was right. The chaos of trying to figure out who'd planted the wrong seeds in the wrong places, or whose turn it was to water, had seemed frustrating at the time. But those little moments of confusion and laughter had turned into something more meaningful. We had grown as individuals, and in the process, we had built something together that was worth far more than a perfect patch of flowers or vegetables. But just when I thought we had wrapped everything up, the universe threw in a little twist that reminded us that life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. As we gathered our gardening tools and prepared to leave, I spotted something out of the corner of my eye, something small and bright, hidden behind a clump of shrubs. Curious, I went over and, to my surprise, discovered a tiny, perfect strawberry hanging from one of the plants we had nearly forgotten about. It was like the universe's way of saying, hey, even the things you overlook can surprise you in the end. I think we've been focusing on the wrong plants, I joked, holding up the tiny strawberry like a trophy. Maybe this is the true masterpiece. Everyone laughed, and Alex, with his usual mischievous grin, replied, "You know what? That's actually a great point. Maybe we should have been growing strawberries all along. Who needs sunflowers when you've got this?" It was a silly, light-hearted moment, but it encapsulated everything we had learned. Even when you think things aren't going according to plan, sometimes life throws in an unexpected delight, and that's what makes it all worth it. The garden wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. And in the end, we realized that the surprises, whether big or small, are often the most enjoyable parts of the journey. As we left the garden that day, our hearts light and our spirits high, we each carried with us a little piece of wisdom. Life, much like gardening, has its ups and downs, its blooms and its wilts. But it's always worth the effort. And sometimes the most unexpected rewards come from the things we least expect. So, with the final twist of that tiny strawberry, we were reminded of what we already knew. Things often work out in the end, and when they don't, well, at least we can laugh about it. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the garden, I couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment wash over me. The journey we had embarked on together, one full of unexpected laughs, minor chaos, and plenty of plants, had come to a perfect end. Sure, things hadn't always gone according to plan, but somehow that made it all the more fun. We had started off thinking this would just be a simple gardening project. We were going to make the garden the talk of the neighborhood, maybe even get some nice veggies and flowers out of it. But what we ended up with was something much more valuable. Bonds strengthened, lessons learned, and a bunch of hilarious stories to look back on. Who knew that a few trips to the garden center and some soil-stained hands would bring out so many surprises, or that a forgotten strawberry could turn out to be the best part of it all? And as we packed up our tools and shared one last laugh over a garden hose mishap, I realized this was only the beginning. The garden may have been done for now, but who knew what other wild ideas would come next? Maybe we tackle a cooking class with Maggie's amazing recipe ideas, or take on something even more ridiculous, like learning to bake sourdough bread from scratch. Whatever it was, I had no doubt it would be filled with the same mix of humor, chaos, and heartwarming moments that made this experience so unforgettable. But for now, we had earned our quiet moment of satisfaction. We'd turned a simple idea into something truly special, and we did it with smiles on our faces and a lot of silly moments to look back on. I'd say that was a pretty perfect outcome. As we said our goodbyes and headed home, I couldn't help but chuckle at the thought of all the little misadventures still ahead. After all, life wasn't about having everything go perfectly. It was about embracing the unexpected, laughing through the messes, and knowing that somehow it all worked out in the end. And who knows, maybe next time I'd find the perfect strawberry. Until then, I'd be holding on to the memories of this garden and the wonderful people who made it an adventure worth remembering. After all, in the grand scheme of things, it was the unexpected moments that made it all worthwhile.